Welcome to the second episode of Drams and Dragons, the podcast about the fantasy genre and whiskey, and probably a few other things along the way. My name is Gus Berger, and with me, as always, is my co-host Dustin Van Horn. How are you doing, man?
Hey Gus, I'm doing good. I got a good hike today. I'm feeling sore. I'm
Nice.
ready to talk about some books and have a dram. How are you doing, man?
Doing great. Also had a hike.
Hey, look at that.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a pretty good hike. Yeah, looking forward to chatting about this week's book. The book we're going to be discussing tonight is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. But first, let's drink something. So, Dustin, what are you drinking? Why don't you introduce that?
So what I'm drinking today is a 21-year-old single malt scotch. It's a Glenfiddich and it's the Gran Reserva. It's from the Gran line. And what about you, Gus? What you got today for us?
I'll be having Ardbeg, and specifically their On Oa expression. It's a Isla single malt scotch. It is kind of a favorite of mine. So I chose this for tonight because I did a little research on our author, Joe Abercrombie, and I found like some really old uh, like thread on his website where he did, because he's a big scotch drinker. Okay.
Mhm.
So but he did this whiskey showdown thing
Mhm.
where he basically would try different whiskeys, and like he had a whole like March Madness style bracket for them,
Whoa,
and he
nice.
whittled it down. Oh yeah, it was like it was extreme, and he whittled it down all the way to, I believe it was Balvenie the Balvenie 15 single barrel, and the Ardbeg Corey Vrecken, which I have not had, and I don't have it, and it's kind of a pricey bottle, so I wasn't going to buy it for just tonight. I'd like to try it at some point. It's supposed to be great, but I got the next closest thing on my shelf, which was the Anoa from the same distillery. But for him, Ardbeg Corey Vrecken won out, so that's why I picked this. Well, and I really like it. So
Yeah, everybody wins. Yeah, shoot, let's pour. And
all right,
conversely, mine's a space side. So rum barrels for this one.
rum
Yeah,
barrels.
rum barrels. It might explain why I ended up adopting this instead of my friend
Mm-hmm.
finishing it. 'Cause it's a challenging flavor profile for me.
Oh,
Because
okay.
yeah, rum and I don't see eye to eye most of the time. And do you remember back it's like in the 20 teens? Is that what they're calling it? 20 teens?
I guess so. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
whiskey.
living through the 20s now. So
Yeah. Geez, time. Um,
yeah, go continue though.
oh yeah, no, they started like rum tasting in the teens. I lived in Hawaii at the time,
Mhm.
and they have all these
Mm,
sugar plantations. So I'm like, oh, I'll
yeah.
go taste some rum, and it was just an awful experience.
Oh no.
I did not care for it
Oh
at
no.
all. Mine, I chose mostly because one, I had it, and two, it's a really deep, dark, rich gold color. And
Mm,
as you start to see when you start aging the whiskeys a little longer, they get so nice and dark and beautiful. Um,
yeah.
a lot like the book we're going to be talking about, which is very dark. That's what I'm looking at. What do you got there, Gus?
Well, the color on the Ardbeg Anoa is solid amber. Yeah, what are you getting?
This was aging for 21 years, and the last 4 months or so, they threw it into some rum barrels. And it's amazing how much of the flavor can come through just in the nose. I get like kind of like if you took a banana and a fig and mixed it together with vanilla,
Yeah.
and it's got that space side thing of like kind of like a like tree, get like oak, like a oaky kind of leathery type thing going on.
For the Ardbeg Anoa, I am getting, I mean, obviously the first thing that just hits you in the face anytime you drink this stuff is smoke and peat.
Yeah.
And but I also am getting on the nose, I'm getting a lot of malt. It's a fairly malty whiskey up front on the nose. At least for me, it is almost chocolatey, slightly.
Yeah. It's so complex though. I mean, that's what I love about Scotch. So much going on in there. Yeah.
Mhm. And every time I put my nose back in, it's just a little different, you know?
you ever had that thing happen where you're tasting the same thing and someone tells you something and then your brain will switch over mid-taste? And you
Oh,
go, "Oh, I taste
absolutely.
yeah."
Definitely. That happens. That happens frequently, I think. There's yeah, and I really like, one of the things about the Ano is they finish it in PX sherry casks. So it gives
Mhm.
it sort of almost like a chocolatey, dried fruit. But I find that more on the taste, the dried. I find I pick up that PX sherry cask. Not so much oakiness, but yeah, the grain really comes through and the sort of the slight, there's just like a slight seaweediness to it.
Seaweed, ooh,
Yeah, slight seaweed. Like it almost just sort of smells slightly of the sea to me.
yeah.
It smells like I'm at like a beach bonfire and we're burning driftwood. And then when you go in for a sip, you get a lot of that sort of dried fruit from the sherry cask.
Mm.
And it's sweet, surprisingly so, given how it smells. And it reminds me almost like a little burned like caramel, like if you get like roasted marshmallow that like burns.
Cool,
Yeah,
toasted marshmallow.
really. Yeah, that's how my brain interprets that is that combination of like the sort of smoke with the sweetness.
Mhm.
Like it turns that into uh this toasted marshmallow flavor that I really like because it reminds me of being at like a beach campfire roasting marshmallows making s'mores, right?
Right.
And it's got like all of those notes. It's got the malt, it's got the chocolate, it's got like the sort of burned sugar, the smoke, the sea, everything. It's really, really fantastic.
Oh, I'm officially jealous, Gus.
How's your well yeah, this you go get yourself a bottle. Yeah,
Well,
how's
yeah, I think I will. Well, so I'm
yeah.
usually an Eiley guy. I think you and I are cut from the same Scotch
Hmm.
cloth. So
For sure.
yeah, Speyside and Highland whiskeys are something I usually appreciate, but I don't gravitate towards.
Yeah.
And this, so when you taste this, it's there's a complexity and a power to it that again you only have it when I've had some 21s and 25s. I haven't had too many that were aged beyond that, but it can kind of feel like an assault on the palate. There's just so much
Hmm.
going on, and the depth of flavor is very powerful. And the first thing that jumps out at me is how the rum has impacted. I taste lime in this. There's like a
Oh wow. Yeah.
yeah, there's a citrusy, but lime specifically, which is very much a rum kind of characteristic that I think of.
Yeah, it's like a full-on tropical fruit, like
Hmm.
bonanza, right?
Yeah, which you don't really expect usually. You-
Not from a scotch, right?
Not from a scotch, exactly. And the there's a spice element to it also. Like it's not
Hmm.
just the heat of the alcohol. There's like almost a pepper kind of
Yeah.
vibe going on with it. And there's actually I, there's almost a little bit because of that pepper. There's a little bit of smokiness to it. It's not a peatiness. Again, just like with the nose, I get a very kind of oaky tree kind of deal. And I like your kind of vision of sitting on the beach, toasting marshmallows, and I'm not sure where I would envision this because it's got the Scotland stuff, right? It's like if you
Hmm.
it's such a Scottish taste, but maybe just I don't know, like well, not eating haggis. Maybe we can cut that part out. No, it's
Hey, haggis is underrated
oh,
as somebody of like Scottish descent.
uh-huh,
Like saying haggis is underrated. It's actually pretty good. Like a well-made one, in the right thing.
right on.
It's
I
actually
would
pretty
try
good
it.
stuff.
I've never had the opportunity. I would try it on your recommendation though. And I don't want to say I don't like it because I think it's wonderful and it's interesting and it's fun to taste, but it's almost like i- if I want to relax and have a scotch, it's kind of too complex for that. It's
Hmm.
busy and there's
Yeah, I got you.
yeah, and it's very tasty, but it's very busy and the flavors kind of they're messing around with my head. Maybe my palate is not sophisticated enough to appreciate it. But
How's the finish? How's the finish on it?
That is what I like about it. It's a good sipper. It's got a very long finish. It stays on the tongue for a while. It's dry.
Is it that it's not sweet, or is it it like kind of dries your mouth out, like a little astringency?
I would say it's kind of a little both. It's definitely not on the sweet side, even though you'd expect it from a rum cask, because
Mm,
that's what
yeah,
I think of. But yeah, there's an astringency to it, and it's not unpleasant. But yeah, how about
yeah.
over there? I'm imagining what your finish is here.
Warm and woody, um, and spicy and very nice actually. As taken, I don't. Those are not normally things that I would like love personally in a finish on a whiskey, but when taken with everything else about it, it actually finishes really nice. Like it's a really great like package.
The Ardbeg sounds well rounded, and that's what I like about Ardbegs in general.
Round is a great word for this one.
Yeah, whereas mine does not feel round. It almost feels like it's trying to take me in
Hmm.
too many directions. And so instead of a round flavor, I get these two opposing ideas. But I'll have to taste more of it to make sure. See if I can change my
Yeah.
assessment. Yeah. Uh,
I absolutely recommend the Ardbeg Anoa. How about you? Would you recommend the Glenfiddich 20, you said 21?
That's a Glenfiddich
Yeah.
Gran Reserva. I would recommend this to advanced whiskey people who have who have a palate that is into kind of big changes. And the whole line is like that. That this one just happens to be a rum, but they have a whole line of kind of creative finishes they've done. So
Yeah.
I'd recommend it for people who they're looking for maybe something a little different, something that's
Hmm.
challenging. But I don't think I'd recommend it for someone who's just looking for like a nice sipping whiskey to have while you're hanging out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
Let's get into the book.
Oh, the book.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, the book we're talking about tonight is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. It is the first book in a trilogy called the First Law Trilogy. And this is not something I've read much of the series. I'm not done with the series. I did manage to finish the first book. I make that sound like it was a chore. It was great. I'm like halfway through the second book. But this is something, Dustin, that you are like super into. I think, am I out of line to say that it's Joe Abercrombie and the First Law trilogy are some of your favorite, like is your favorite author, one of your favorite authors, one of your favorite books?
Yeah, you're well in line. That's
Okay.
pretty
All
accurate.
right.
I mean, I started reading Joe Abercrombie. These books came out a while ago, and as often happens with books, you read them at times in your life, and they kind of get connected with those times. And I read these books when I was enlisted in the army, when I had lots of time to read and very few responsibilities other than work. This is before I got married or had a kid, and the book's been with me for a long time. So I'm actually really interested to hear your perspective because you have kind of a fresh, recent perspective. And for
Sure.
for me, I listened to these. Actually, I read them first, and then I listened to them. The audiobooks are excellent.
Mm-hmm.
They are the performer they have is by far the best performer. It's hard to listen to anything else after you listen
Wow.
to his performance in these.
Yeah, that
So
high praise. High praise.
yeah,
If you had to pick out like one thing about these books, and I say these books, but really this book, The Blade itself, what drew you into this book?
well, I got one word for you, Gus. Glatka.
Yeah, Glockta is for our audience. Glockta is one of the main characters of this book. There are several sort of chapter characters, characters who from whom the perspective is written. And Glockta is a character who's very complicated.
Mhm.
If for the audience, if you watched Game of Thrones or you read Game of Thrones, the books, a character that I would sort of say that he's a little bit similar to is Tyrion.
Mm.
He's sort of complicated. He's not always a good guy. He has significant physical disabilities. He's sort of looked down upon by other characters. He, does some really terrible things in order to do what he has to do. Yeah. What did you like about Glockta? because
Yeah.
I agree. He was easily the most compelling character to me in the book.
I was thinking about it, and I remember there's a scene where he takes a tumble down some stairs. There's this moment where in the character's head he's talking about that moment when you know you're going to be in excruciating pain, but it's this beautiful moment between when you are hurt and when you feel the pain. And that stuck with me because it's such a human experience, and that's what got me hooked into the character. And I'm glad you compared him to Tyrion because there's so much tragedy to Glotka's character. There's this
There is.
yeah, and there's this delicious dark humor that comes out of that, this gallows humor, this like world wise, world weary humor that comes out
Yeah,
of it.
you get
Yeah.
his thoughts, right? You get his
Yeah.
thoughts, and he's very cynical, but he's also, yeah, he's got that humor. Though he rarely actually expresses it, right? It's always in his head,
Mhm.
or usually in his head, anyway.
For me, he's kind of the poster child for this book in that it defines the genre that it's in, and it's grimdark.
I think there are some disagreements with what books are grimdark, or how to define the genre of all the grimdark I've read. I've read a lot.
Mhm.
It's not the first, it's not the darkest, but in terms of, really sort of exemplifying the genre in terms of moral gray, and in terms of the sort of broken world, and in sort of not necessarily a depressing world all the time. Like there's still good in it, and there's still like beauty in it, and whatnot. But in terms of sort of that sort of, the moral grayness and the sort of tragedy and the complex characters,
Yeah.
like there really aren't like good guys and big heroes in the sort of way you think. Like even the characters who are the chapter characters, the perspective characters, right? Glokta. Another one is that we could talk about is,
Logan.
Logan, Nine Fingers, right? These characters are not good guys. They're not. I mean, they're kind of the good guys, but they're not good guys. Like I think there's a clear bad guy, or there are clear bad guys. Everything else is sort of this morally gray space, which is, yeah, really, I think exemplifies what grimdark kind of is.
It was interesting. I started doing the reread when we were preparing for this, and
Mhm.
it did that thing too, where books like a different time in your life that you read it, you get different things from it. Something that feels grimdark to me is this idea of being a middle-aged person, or even late middle age. So you're in your 40s or 50s. Glatka's only in his 30s, his mid 30s. They've had kind of their golden days of youth, and now they're living with the consequences of that, and they are grim for both of the characters I mentioned. And with Glatka, it comes out in a lot of ways. He visualizes himself um, having bad things happen to him, kind of a giggle. Then there's this giggling way about it, like, and then maybe my pain will end, maybe this existence will end. And for me rereading this, it was actually a little hard to read it because it hits close to home in terms of aging and having things maybe you're not proud of that you did, or things that are these complicated things in your life. And then here you are in the present day, and you've kind of learned from them, but they still happened, and yet you're forced to kind of reconcile with how things are now versus how they were. And that to me felt very grim because these people did some messed up some messed up things happened to them. And in Logan's case, he was I don't know, what would you call Logan?
Yeah, he's this character that's this bloody warrior who fought for the bad guy, and then eventually, I can't even say he had a change of heart, right? Because but he
Right.
was he was he fought for the one of the bad guys as his right hand guy, right? And then eventually ran afoul of him, and was kicked out and exiled. He's this sort of older, wiser, regretful guy, right? I mean, he's still a strong warrior. He's still a powerful, fighter. But he's got some regrets. He's got some baggage.
And to give the listeners an idea, if you haven't heard it, I mean, his named man name is the Bloody Nine, and he didn't earn it by being gentle or wise. Um,
Yeah. The thing to me that makes this book really hit hard is how he writes his characters.
yeah.
Is you really feel like you're in their shoes, you're in their head.
Hmm.
What do you think is the thing about his writing that just sucks you into the perspective of these characters?
Well, kind of, I kind of glanced off of it earlier with talking about how the reader's able to identify life stages through the characters. So Logan's an example of someone who's maybe like gotten out of control at some point and they did something they regret. And you feel that when you read his character, and there's this reluctance to what he does in the present day. There's a great line when he's talking to Baez. He says, I can't trust myself to make the right decision. I don't want to know what's going on. Just tell me what to do. And it's a sense of like, I can't do this. And then Baez is complicated, and I think he's more of a kind of a, there's a trope kind of turned on its head with him. But like another character we haven't gone into, there's a young wastrel noble
Yeah.
person, right? But
Yeah.
even
I
with
was
him,
just thinking that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, because you read it, you think of all the dumb stuff he did in like your 20s, like just all the vain, vapid things that most people do. That's the funny thing. Like I'm pushing 40 and reading this, it's like I can identify with that. That's a young man, that's a young Dustin looking back through time. And so I just feel even with Baez, so there's a scene where Baez, lovely foreshadowing, by the way, when you meet Baez. I remember there's a scene where Baez murders a bunch of people. One of their companions is hurt. It's Baez's what's it called? A apprentice, right? Or no, sorry, it's not the apprentice. It's another named man. What's a Lactose? So a friend of Logan's has been crushed by a horse, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a former friend, right? I
Hmm.
mean, they were friends. Now they're on opposite sides, right?
Yeah, exactly. But there's a respect there, and Logan looks up.
Mhm.
So he looks up and he's like, "Can you help me? Can you help?" And the callousness of the person with the power was something I think that spoke to me too. And just the thoughtlessness of that violence was really striking. It just that stuff kind of gets its hooks into you. It's like if you've ever seen something terrible happen. I know you and I both were like 9/11 generation people where we saw these terrible things unfold on TV.
Yeah.
Just this
Yeah.
feeling of kind of helplessness against the powers that be. And Baez it comes across like that. It's funny that we both said characterization. I have that underlined here on my thing. Like, what was it
Mhm.
that popped out to you?
Yeah, I think he writes really interesting, sort of gray, complex, realistic characters who are put into these situations. And then he really gets you into their mindset so that you really understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, getting you into the sort of mindset and emotional place of the characters that you're following, whether it's Jezal and all of his. How did you pronounce that name, by the way? Jezal. I have no idea how to sub it.
Giselle, I think I did.
Giselle,
Like a Jezza.
Jezal, whatever his name is. It's spelled Jezal.
Hmm.
But whether it's Jizzle, or whether it's Logan Nine Fingers, or whether it's Glocta, or whether it's any of the other. There's a few other characters that have chapters in the book. Like kind of like whichever character it is, like you understand why they're doing what they're doing. You may not agree with what they're doing. You may not like what they're doing. Yeah, he does a really good job of letting you in, and they're not always, and they feel real, right?
Yeah.
They all feel realistic, and I was sort of struck by Captain West, and he's just such a complicated character. He's not a good guy. He's not a bad guy. He's a complicated guy. He only has a few chapters that are, his perspective in the book. He's not a noble, but he's an officer, which it puts him in a kind of difficult position sometimes. And he's a combat veteran. He's experienced. He knows what he's doing. He's very competent, and he's mostly very level headed. But then there's a very difficult scene where this character, who's normally very reasonable and rational and sane, kind of loses his temper, just completely loses his shit and abuses his sister violently. The way that Joe Abercrombie writes all this, it pulls you in. You feel for these characters tremendously.
Yeah, because he kind of juggles stuff, right? Like he performs it well. He does the writings is such that you are able to suspend your disbelief. you say you believe in the character. You go, I believe this person would do this. It doesn't seem out of character. It doesn't seem like
Yep.
Deus Das Machina,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is a pet peeve of mine. Like when stuff just happens because, or the character does it because.
Yeah.
Um, this it doesn't happen with that. And I think you hit on. I think both of us have kind of been skirting this edge. There's a again, maybe this goes back to the grimdark. Each of these characters has a dark side to them, and as a
Mhm.
reader, and kind of in our modern age where we don't really talk about or explore our dark sides very often, it's fascinating to get inside a believable character who has this kind of dark side.
Yeah. I think the other thing that sucks you in is
Mm,
his prose. His prose are great.
yes.
His prose were good enough that, like, say half the time or more, I was just visualizing it almost like a movie in my head. Have you ever,
Oh
there's
yeah, it's very cinematic, I would call it. Yeah, it's a cinematic
very
prose.
cinematic.
Mhm.
He's such a vivid, like, describer of scenes and action and of people. Like, he describes people's appearances really well.
Mhm.
So you just sort of, you can visualize it. So it's this sort of interesting combination where he's writing it. It's very cinematic. He's also like giving you this insight into these people's minds,
Yeah.
and they're complicated, real people, and it all kind of comes together in this way that's really nice. It's
Yeah.
really good.
And it's often very funny too, which I think is the probably the
Mm-hmm.
next I was gonna ask you. That was a big thing that popped out to me with it too. And to illustrate that point, there's a scene. Uh, so Glatka is an inquisitor, and he has these. They call them practicals, basically henchmen that run around with him, right?
Yeah.
And Joe Abercrombie's writing there. It's almost like a Monty Python sketch whenever they have a scene. I love Glatka chapters, especially if the practicals are involved.
Yeah. No,
And
they're good.
yeah, it's just so good. And there's dad jokes in there. There's the kind of gallows type humor. But the way there's one scene I remember that stuck out in my head where one of them doesn't laugh ever. Uh, he never laughs. Glatka cracks a joke, and it's very funny. It's very dark. It's very gallows, and all you see is a poof of breath out of the mask of the practical,
Mm-hmm.
indicating that that was very funny for him. Like for him, that was like another person laughing out loud. But
Yeah.
just that little tiny flair, just it's so rich. It gave you all this information on the characters, and yeah, Abercrombie does a wonderful job.
Yeah, he does. And I agree about there's a fair amount of humor in the book. Um, there were a few things that I thought were very funny where there's some different scenes where he's like, say one thing for Logan Nine Fingers, say he's stealthy, and then immediately he like trips and makes a bunch of noise, right? So um but there's different things like that, right, throughout the
Yeah,
books where there's sort of subtle humor.
he's a British author, and that's kind of the vibe I had with it. There's some dry British humor, you know?
Yeah, dry is the word I was going to use. Yeah, there's one thing that I did not really like about the book, about
Oh,
the first book.
hmm,
But I will say that this might be irrelevant, like when we talk about like the series as a whole.
oh yeah,
um which is that it the first book felt like a prologue. It felt like a book
hmm,
length prologue, right? Like the ending of the book did not hit for me. The end of the book, I was waiting for there to be like a big moment or a big reveal or a big.
yeah,
It didn't have that. It felt like it ended in a way where you were like, okay, it's kind of sort of like it's setting up a second book,
yeah.
right? So it felt to me like it's a prologue for a bigger book, or a prologue for the series. And obviously, it's a trilogy, and like you say, there's even multiple trilogies.
Yeah.
uh, hmm,
But that kind of like snappy, every book has a complete arc. I kind of
yeah,
associate with new fantasy, like stuff written in the last 10 years or so, where it's gotten so fast paced and almost, if I'm being honest, a little manic. Like everything has to have a climax at the end. I'm like, ah, and that's something I feel you. And I think that's a very valid kind of not criticism, but just kind of an observation with the book. Like it's definitely part of the trilogy, and it's complete that the arc is the trilogy. I would.
yeah. I think that it being part of a trilogy if you view each book as an act,
Mhm.
yeah, sure.
Mhm.
I'll keep reading because it's entertaining and because, I'm really interested in some of the characters and
Yeah.
Arklocta and Logan Nine Fingers and Captain, or now yeah, I won't spoil the second book, and Captain West.
Uh-huh.
And some of the other characters. I really like, by the way, I really like Logan's old band. He has this old group of like warriors. They have a few
Yeah,
chapters in this book.
they're great.
There's the perspective that you get, I think, in all the chapters, at least all the ones I've read so far, is through the perspective of a tracker and scout named Dogman.
Dogman.
But there's a whole group of these like kind of like northern barbarian warriors
The named
who
men.
are
Yeah.
they're all named men who are exiled with Logan Nine Fingers, but they've been separated, right? And those guys are really interesting to me. I hope they go somewhere in the story and they're not just like a dead end
Mhm.
because they're fantastic. I think Black Dow and Dogman and Three Trees and
What's his name? The weaker. Yeah, the weaker guy.
yeah, there's just a great little cast of characters in this group, and I hope they're actually going somewhere because I've gotten very attached to them. So
Yeah. Well, I won't spoil anything, so I won't say
thank
anything
you,
else.
appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I feel the same about him. Anytime there's Northmen involved with books, like you're reading a books and there's like little things that you enjoy about books. And I love novelty. I like exploration. I like secrets that are slowly revealed throughout the narrative. And one of those secrets is Logan's background and the whole culture of the North. And especially having read all the books, it's been so fun going back through because I see these seeds planted for the long arc that is the
Yeah,
9 book kind of over series. And there's just some wonderful, wonderful stuff in there, and there's some great payoff um, with just the culture of the North people, the magic they use, the just everything about it.
yeah, and it's interesting. I feel like they're not just like copy pasted like Vikings or not just copy pasted like
Mm,
Scotsmen or something. Like they're a little more interesting than that.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a weakness of Joe Abercrombie's, but it's also not like his great strength. I don't think his world building is as good as like some authors, as good as
Oh yeah, like Buellman
Christopher
last week.
Beelman
Yeah.
last week, or Robert Jordan, or a lot of these guys. Like his world building is not to the same level as those some of those authors. His strength really is the characters, the descriptions, like the prose, the descriptions. That said, there are some interesting spins, right? There are some interesting spins on some of these, on some cultures,
Mhm.
some of the peoples of the world. Um,
And tropes too. There's some spins on
mhm.
tropes. Uh,
There are. He spins these things pretty well.
and I think it's purposeful. That I get this feeling. I mean, everything has such a dark edge to it. I think even part of the way he chooses to write is purposeful, like denying us the satisfying ending we want in a book. That's very in
Yeah.
keeping with the characters in the book and the experience they're having.
Hmm.
There's not a lot of. In fact, he has a book later called Sharp Ends, which
Hmm.
might tell you something about how the characters work in this. But yeah, he takes kind of what we expect. I mean, Baez is a great example. So here we have kind of a wizard archetype, and he's kind of funny. He's kind of wise, and he's got an apprentice, and they have this kind of cute interaction at first, and the apprentice is lazy, and they have this lovely foreshadowing. I remember Logan says he looks like a butcher. That's the first thing he says because he was in his kind of the library that they find Baez in. He's butchering stuff. One of the first things Baez says too, he says, "Ah, I'm a liar," and you get this
Hmm.
wonderful like foreshadowing just with the language he uses, and then you kind of like you want him to be like this cool, friendly older wizard guy, and then slowly, it, kind of against your will, he turns into something very different. And I just,
He's got a real temper, you
oh
know.
yeah, put it,
He's
yeah,
not. Yeah, he's got a real temper. We'll
he
just we'll
does.
just put it at that. He's not. He's not like the friendly, Gandalf, right?
No, no. Yeah, that's how I know an author's been successful with me. It's when I start making excuses for different like possible shortcomings in the writing. Like, no, 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 that's just part of the plan. And and
Yeah.
Abercrombie, yeah, he hooked me like that. And he's got good taste. He's a whiskey guy, not unlike ourselves.
Yeah, he is. He is whiskey guy. Not all the authors we have planned are, but
Try not to hold it
Joe
against him.
Abercrombie definitely. Yeah, right.
I know before we moved on, I really wanted to um, say something about the audiobook performance. I've already mentioned that it was just incredible.
Yeah, you mentioned it was really good.
Yeah, if you want to Google it, I would recommend to Google. The guy's name is Stephen Pacey, and he's been working with Abercrombie for decades now. And
Mm,
he was a Shakespearean actor. It's the best audiobook performance I've ever heard. It's so awesome.
nice.
And it
Yeah, that's high praise there.
and like his Glotka's very good. He manages to sound like someone who's missing half his teeth. It's so good. I couldn't recommend the audiobooks enough. And with my schedule these days, I mostly listen because I drive for 3 hours a day. So it's a lovely way to experience this book.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so I would say anybody who wants to pick up this book should.
Mhm.
It is
Do it.
it is grimdark. There are some things that might be, triggering for some people. Like I mentioned, there's a scene with some domestic violence. There's a lot more violence than that,
Yeah.
but it's really well written.
Yeah, I agree. Do it. Yeah, it's and
do
so
do it.
do it. That goes back. That's fucking old school. I am one of those people that I can become ill if I read something that if it's hyper violent
Hmm.
or bloody or if
Yeah.
they describe things a certain way. I never got to that point with these books. I didn't feel like it was overly gratuitous, and he has a very nice pacing where it's visceral, it's real, and it's not pleasant. But then he kind of goes in there, and there's something funny will happen. Like the main character will shout, I'm alive," and then get whacked by a tree limb or something like that. And he has these lovely little moments of levity. So yeah, yeah, definitely give it a read. Be a little careful. Be kind to yourself. But yeah, I think it's super rewarding and a great experience.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. If you made it this far, uh, we hope you enjoyed the show, and we will be back next time. I started up an Instagram account to talk about or to post pictures of what we're going to be doing sort of ahead of time. So if you want to know what book and at least what whiskey I'm going to be drinking, um, you can check me out on Instagram, Knut Berger, KNUTEBERGER. And like I said, I'll just be posting things related to the podcast. And so if you're interested, follow me there. And like and subscribe, I guess.
That's what we're supposed to
I
say.
don't. I never thought I was. So yeah, that's what I'm supposed to say, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I'm supposed to say like and subscribe. Like
yeah.
follow us on Spotify. Follow us on.
Hmm.
So
It
we're
really
supposed
helps
to
us
say
out.
that. So that's
Yeah, it really helps. No.
it. Yeah, really help us out if we're just. I mean, look. Hey, if you listen and you follow and our audience grows, maybe we can afford some whiskeys that aren't already on our shelves. I'm just saying, right? So, so
Oh,
yeah. All right. Well, thank
yeah.
you, everybody, and have a good night.